So please join me in welcoming Michael Liu. He's a lifelong activist and scholar of the Boston Chinatown community and the author of Forever Struggle, Activism, Identity, and Survival in Boston's Chinatown, 1880 to 2018, which we have recently acquired at the library in Shrewsbury, so please come and check it out. There are also a couple other copies in the CW Mars network as well. Michael is a former senior research associate at the Institute for Asian American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michael. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to everyone for showing up tonight. I know it's a nice day today and still a nice evening. And I also want to thank Jessica and the Shrewsbury Public Library for hosting this event. So I'm going to be talking about the history of Chinese in Massachusetts, but also try to link it to the anti-Asian hate violence that's happening today. I also will be showing a few images to kind of break up my talk and hopefully make it more interesting. Boston merchants were leading players in the China trade, and so that led to individual Chinese appearing in Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. So the one notable group was young Chinese men sponsored by the Chinese government. This program sent scores of students to schools in the western part of the state. The first large contingent of Chinese arrived in North Adams in the northwest corner of Massachusetts in 1870. Calvin Sampson, the owner of his eponymous factory, hired 75 Chinese workers to break a strike of unionized shoemakers. But it was really racist violence in the West that drove most Chinese to the eastern US and to Massachusetts. White workers, supported by many politicians, led a campaign to drive Chinese workers out of many areas. So arguably the largest lynching in US history occurred when a mob hung 15 Chinese men and killed several others in 1871 in Los Angeles. Denver, Seattle, Tacoma, and Rock Springs, Wyoming were among the over 150 communities that organized similar violence and drove out all Chinese from their borders. Established publications, politicians, and organizations such as Harper's Weekly and unions portrayed Chinese as not assimilable and often subhuman. And so that Calvin Sampson's use of Chinese labor as strikebreakers spoke to the dynamic between white labor, business owners, and Chinese workers. So let me just share a couple of images here. This is a illustration from Harper's Weekly illustrating the massacre of Chinese in Rock Springs, Wyoming. This is an image of the Chinese workers that were brought to North Adams to work at Sampson's shoe factory. Most of these people were quite young, and about half was between ages of 14 to 16. Here's another image from Harper's Weekly. And this illustrates kind of attitudes at the time where the Chinese are portrayed as sneaking up behind the angelic white shoemaker and about to behead him. And the caption on this illustration is the martyrdom of St. Crispin, whereas the Crispins represented the name of the labor organization. Also, notice that the Chinese is portrayed having queues, whereas when you look at the other illustrations, most Chinese had cut off the queues and wore hats in those previous illustrations, because the queue actually represented loyalty to the Qing dynasty that was ruled China at the time. the Chinatowns in the eastern United States were refuges for the Chinese against a unwelcoming, sometimes hostile, larger society. So Boston Chinatown was one of many that established themselves in the eastern United States during that period. Chinatowns now today most long gone emerged in Chicago, Hartford, Providence, Baltimore, Columbus, Jersey City, Detroit, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, and numerous other cities. They were typically located in low-income, immigrant-depressed areas close to transportation hubs and factories. And in 1880, the Boston Globe acknowledged a quote-unquote Chinese quarter near the intersection of Harrison Avenue and Beach Street. And I have an illustration for that. This is a graphic from the Boston Globe in 1893, I believe, and it shows that the Chinese who were on the east side of Harrison Avenue, and on this side was the white businesses, and this is a view looking south. And when Boston eventually decided to expand this street, you can see the deep furrows in it. They only took the businesses on the eastern side where the Chinese were, but the Chinese rebuilt. So the antipathy toward the Chinese took place in a period that was sandwiched between the Mexican-American and Spanish-American wars, that is between American expansionism across the continent in quote-unquote manifest destiny and imperialism internationally. So there were ideological justifications of US white and Christian superiority that supported these campaigns. This was also an era of high immigration that saw migrants originating more from the southern and eastern areas of Europe. This is aside from the Irish, who continue to come over in large numbers. So this provoked strong anti-immigration sentiments and campaigns. However, anti-Chinese attitudes were particularly strong. So that consequently, 2 years after the recognition of a Chinese enclave in Boston, the federal government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act, the only federal legislation that identified an ethnic group for exclusion, initiated a series of laws that banned Chinese immigration into the US for 60 years. And as scholar May Nye has pointed out, the exclusion legislation generated the first quote unquote illegal immigrants, and also the first quote unquote alien citizens. That is, people who were citizens by birth, but assumed by mainstream culture to be foreign. And politicians particularly targeted Chinese women. They were pictured as likely prostitutes. Chinese already here were also denied citizenship. And these acts gave birth to the US Border Patrol as part of efforts to prevent Chinese migrations. And these laws would profoundly shape the early Chinatown community. And this is, I just want to illustrate, this is a political cartoon from Puck magazine around the turn of the century, which kind of illustrates the attitudes at the time around imperialism. Because here is Uncle Sam portrayed as a teacher of over the people of the colonies that they had taken over. So you have the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. In the back here are Latinx peoples who had been conquered during the Mexican-American War. So you have Texas and California, as well as other Western states. By the door, you have the Native Americans who's actually holding a book that's upside down. And by the door, because they had not yet been colonized, was the Chinese. And on the blackboard, it says, the US must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. And this is sort of like the attitude for this period. This is an image of the Border Patrol, which, as I mentioned, had been organized to prevent Chinese from migrating over the Mexican and Canadian borders. So the Chinese community, as a consequence, became a bachelor society where Chinese were limited to menial occupations, while they attempted to work as factory and farm workers, as servants, and as peddlers. The population began to focus on the laundry industry. The general public saw laundry work as women's work, and this was an area that didn't compete with white male labor. And further, until the 1940s, state law prohibited Chinese from more than 20 professional occupations, and other laws restricted public sector employment to citizens or required union membership for many trades. So these barriers obviously excluded Chinese. And then following the expansion of new streetcar and railroad lines, Chinese hand laundries spread throughout every county in Massachusetts. Boston Chinatown was the center of the state and New England Chinese community, because typically outlying towns refused housing and services to Chinese or other people of color. So the Chinese American laundrymen had to sleep in their shops, often on the ironing boards. And for any services and entertainment, they had to make periodic trips to Boston Chinatown. So Neil Chin, who was a laundry worker in the 1920s, recalled, when you go to work in the laundry, you would stay in that laundry all week long. You ate there, you worked there, you slept there. You would have to get up around 6 o'clock in the morning, possibly start work at around 6:30, and you wouldn't stop until 12 o'clock, midnight. If you were lucky, or if you were a fast worker, you would have the luxury of coming up to Boston or back to Chinatown. Soon after arriving in the United States, Chinese immigrants quickly formed associations to provide essential services, mediate disputes, and assure payment of debts. These associations were organized on ties of geography and kinship. The Chinese population also formed umbrella groups to more actively intervene with US institutions. In Boston, the chosen name for the umbrella association was the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association of New England, and the merchant class and larger families dominated the CCBA as well as the associations. During this time, the community leadership cultivated relations with sectors of white Boston to give the community space to develop. So this was demonstrated during a notorious 1903 police sweep of Chinatown. The community was able to leverage its relationships and alliances to organize a rally of hundreds of non-Chinese in support of the neighborhood. So those publicly denouncing the raid included well-known abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Reverend John Galbraith, and several Sunday school teachers. Worcester abolitionist George Frisbee Hoare, who was then a US Senator, was also an outspoken advocate for Chinese. But the community also developed other spontaneous connections to other segments of the Boston population. In 1919, the women telephone operators at the telephone exchange on Harrison Avenue, who were primarily Irish American, the telephone exchange was adjacent to Chinatown, and the telephone workers went out on strike. And the Chinatown residents supported the strikes with food and other efforts. And the strikers remembered the Chinatown residents fondly. Successful laundries also began to hire white women to do the scrubbing of clothes in their laundries. But both the white families involved and Chinese proprietors kept their roles quiet. Partly as a result of the ban on the immigration of Chinese women, occasional interracial marriages developed, primarily involving white or Irish wives. To evangelize among the Chinese American population, many churches established Sunday schools, but there was public alarm rose about female Sunday school teachers' relations with their male students, a few which resulted in marriage. Shauna Lowe and Laura Eng has estimated about 136 interracial marriages in the 45 years from 1886 to 1930. And I have a kind of interesting illustration here of, this is an image of a white woman, Bella Long, who married a Chinese man. She was called the Queen of Chinatown. This was around the turn of the century, and she was called Queen of Chinatown because she played a key role in intervening with outside, with government and with outside institutions. But how she's pictured here in this illustration from the Boston Post is that she's seen smoking opium, because one image of Chinese was that they seduce white women and often do the use of opium. And it's quite ironic because actually, when I mentioned that Boston played a leading role in the China trade, what they did was that they actually smuggled opium into China. It was illegal to have opium in China, but that's how families like the Cabots, the Forbes, and the Wells built their fortunes in Boston. It's through the China trade of opium. But here it's pictured as a negative use of drugs. So circumstances slowly began to change at the turn of the 20th century. One was the displacement of laundries by restaurants and food service as a center of the Chinese population. Technological advances, the washing machine and steam presses, began to undermine the Chinese hand laundry business, which 95% of the population was engaged in, had been engaged in at one point. So food service became one of the few viable occupations open to Chinese. During the Victorian period, the social practice of slumming helped introduce white visitors to quote unquote exotic Chinatown and its many restaurants. So newspapers at the time identified public officials, police chiefs, social and cultural clubs, convention goers, and reverends among those participating in the practice of slumming. Another source of customers for Chinese restaurants became the Jewish population, who dominated the garment industry in Boston at the time. And the garment industry had migrated to Boston Chinatown. And so in time, Jewish family dining at Chinese restaurants became a popular cultural tradition. And by the 1920s, restaurants were easily found in Chinatown and elsewhere in Boston. And large nightclub type Chinese restaurants operated in many parts of the city. These establishments catered to a non-Chinese clientele and featured dancing, big band music, and cabaret. So the context for the association of Chinese working men with traditionally gendered work like laundry and food service was thus rooted in practices of exclusion and discrimination. And the community strategy of avoiding conflict within a hostile environment probably aligned with this association. I have a couple more slides here. This is an illustration from a magazine showing the practice of slumming, but this is actually New York City. Here's an ad from the Boston Herald in 1930. It advertises the opening of a new Chinese restaurant on Winchester Street, which is not in Boston Chinatown. But notice that it advertises an orchestra and a big floor show. And that was how these restaurants were able to succeed outside of Chinatown. However, the gender composition of the community slowly changed along with the transition into the food service industry. An exception to the ban on Chinese female immigration were the wives of Chinese merchants and scholars. So the growth of restaurants and grocers granted their owners merchant status. Laundries had been specifically excluded. So this allowed those owners to bring in their wives and develop a family presence. So the 1910 census identified 25 families among Chinatown's residents. And by 1930, the number of families had nearly tripled. But it was Japan's incursions into China in the 1930s that most profoundly changed the Chinese community's relationship to the larger society. As stories of Japanese abuse in China circulated in the press, sympathy for Chinese Americans grew. And this empathy only strengthened when the United States entered the war against Japan in 1945. So among US racial groups, probably the treatment of Asian Americans is more tightly tied to US relations to these groups' origin countries. And the situation of Chinese Americans have slowly improved, but always been tenuous and contingent on relations between the US and China. The Second World War eventually loosened the restrictions on Chinese immigration. Chinese exclusion was increasingly an embarrassing policy, given that China was a wartime ally of the United States. This even became a propaganda fodder for Japanese radio broadcasts, and it also spurred domestic protests. So Congress formally repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act and related legislation in 1943, though it continued to severely limit immigration of Chinese to a small annual quota. There were also Chinese Americans who were fought in the US Army during World War II. In fact, Chinese had served in the US Armed Forces, a few going back to the Civil War. Here you can see in the middle, primarily people from the Army, but there's also some sailors in the front. And this here is the more or less the center of Chinatown. This is Beach Street and Harrison Avenue, the street that we saw previously. And though housing discrimination was still common, Chinese were also beginning to find housing outside of the Chinatown enclave. But the communist victory in China led to reversions of this progress. This was the beginning of the communist victory in China was 1949. The beginning of the Cold War started in the 50s, and McCarthyism prevailed. So one of McCarthyism's main points of attack was who lost China, implying the presence of traitors and third columns in the country. So suspicion of the Chinese community was part of this campaign, despite the community leadership's staunch anti-communism. So harassment of certain organizations, FBI investigations into Chinatowns, and a national investigation into the immigration status of a significant portion of community members hung over the Chinese community in the 1950s. However, immigration reform legislation led to other profound changes. This allowed the reunification of families and gave preference for immigrants with professional and managerial backgrounds. And it actually led to a large increase in Chinese as well as other immigrants from many parts of the world that had been shut out previously. Also, the growing number of families led to a generation who in the post-war environment could attend college and find professional employment. So this all led to a class transformation of the Chinese community, which had been previously overwhelmingly working class. And with the change in social standing was a transformation of the political attitudes of Chinese Americans. The first large native-born generation began to assert the civil rights and to demand equal treatment. So they had come of age during the civil rights, Vietnam War, and Black Power periods of the 1950s to 1970s. So Chinese Americans became much more civically and politically engaged in the mainstream society. A number of young Chinese Americans participated in the civil rights movement. And many of the service agencies, advocacy groups, and grassroots organizations that are found in Chinatowns date back to this period. In recent decades, Boston Chinatown has arguably been the most active neighborhood in the city, particularly around development issues. And also a number of younger Chinese decided to run for elective office, and Michelle Wu, the Boston mayor, is probably the most prominent example. So Chinese immigration has continued at a substantial level since 1965. During the last decades, other enclaves outside of Chinatown have developed. The most notable are in the cities of Quincy and Malden. The professional and managerial proportion of the community, however, have settled in more suburban areas. These suburban Chinese often come from diverse parts of China and Taiwan, and they are distinct from the early Chinese laborers and Chinatown people who are from areas near Hong Kong. And so as a consequence, today, the Chinese population is very polarized socioeconomically. The Chinese American middle class is concentrated in scientific, technical, health, and academic occupations, and Chinese American laborers are in hospitality, food service, and personal care fields. So I have some slides to illustrate this. This is, of course, Yo-Yo Ma, probably the most well-known Chinese American figure among Chinese professionals. This is a slide from the 1980s when the community began to get involved in electoral politics. This is a march supporting Mel King for mayor, 1983. March through Chinatown. And this is a more recent image of workers, home care workers who had just unionized and won the right to negotiate a contract. There's quite a few Chinese now in home care. So I just want to end by connecting the current wave of anti-Asian hate to this history, so that regardless of Chinese American station in life, they are targets of hate, though women and the elderly have been disproportionately victims. And today's violence is actually rooted in yesterday's continuing attitudes. So what is often forgotten is the casual and daily violence against Chinese soon after they came to the US. And out of this history has been a hodgepodge of tropes about Chinese Americans. One of the most profound is that Chinese Americans are perpetual foreigners, regardless of the nativity and citizen status. In 1898, a staff person in a major Boston settlement house wrote that the Chinese, quote, can never be in any real sense American, end quote. And today that attitude still persists to Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans. They associate us with events and policies overseas. and we are suspect here as spies with unreliable loyalties. Thus, we are fair game for anger at China's policies and actions that we as a country oppose. When I say we as a country, I'm referring to the United States. And we can see how this is closely related to the history of denial of citizenship to the Chinese and the erasure of our contributions and role in the building of the country. So a related trope is the passive guess, where a population is made invisible. In a recent survey of Americans, asking them to name a prominent Asian American, a plurality, over 40% responded, I don't know. The highest identified individual, 11%, was Jackie Chan, who's an actor and a citizen of Hong Kong, and not an American, obviously. So few Americans know that Chinese Americans literally built the mining, farming, and fishing industries, as well as the Transcontinental Railroad in the Western US. These contributions are deliberately ignored and erased. For example, when dignitaries organized a ceremony for the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese workers who had died in the Sierras building the railroad were deliberately excluded. 100 years later, at a centennial celebration in 1969, John Volpe, who was a former governor of the state of Massachusetts, but was then the US Secretary of Transportation, would not acknowledge the Chinese role in the railroads. So no wonder Chinese Americans are often seen as benefiting from, but never contributing to US development. And then another stereotype is seeing Chinese as a yellow peril. This can take the form of a cunning opium smoker who preys upon white women, or promiscuous prostitutes who seduce white men. So we threaten the very basis of American society. So that was the root of the Atlanta killer's motivation for killing Asian women. This is the ceremony when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed that I mentioned. If you look closely at all these faces who were at the ceremony, there is not one Chinese face. And these are the 6 victims of the shootings in Atlanta. So many other stereotypes abound: cheap labor, overachieving nerds, sneaking spies, emasculated passive males, promiscuous submissive women, dirty and filthy consumers of dogs and cats, and so on. So in this hodgepodge, convenient tropes are always available to scapegoat and justify hate against Asian Americans when economic dislocation or other social problems arise. But in fact, US society, and not the history and behavior of Chinese Americans, created and nurtured these tropes. Thus, it is up to us as a society to become educated about the deep roots of Chinese Americans here and the historical legacy of hate against them. This has fed the current wave of violence against Asians. So either we develop a more critical understanding of history, or hate will continue to repeat itself. And I think we can all agree it's better to work together for a better understanding of the lives of all the constituents of this grand and diverse country. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was a really interesting presentation. I especially liked some of those visuals, which I had never seen before. And of course, those photos at the end are very poignant. So now we can open it up for questions from the audience, the guests. We already have one in the chat. So if you would prefer to type it in the chat rather than unmute yourself, please feel free. So I think we can go ahead with that first question. So if you could tell us some about the controversy and outcome of the recent construction plans in Chinatown.
Well, actually, well, I'm not sure if you're referring to a specific controversy or not. There is, I mean, throughout the existence of Chinatown, there's been a a lot of development that has threatened the community. And actually, the book I wrote was about the community efforts to to fight against development in a way that drives out the Chinese population there. There was actually, several attempts, including the urban renewal plan, which was designed to eliminate all the housing in the residential area of Chinatown. But there was actually several other attempts previously. So, but I don't know if the question refers to a specific project.
So if anyone wants to clarify or add to that, please feel free to unmute and ask a question or raise your hand. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a reaction button with a little emoji face, a little smiley face, and there's a option there to raise hand. But I have a question, maybe, Michael, you could try to speak to this sort of push and pull between maintaining the community and culture in Chinatown compared to that trope that you mentioned of being the always an alien, never assimilating.
Well, I guess in a way, I think that there's, I think a part of the population, is, for want of a better phrase, assimilating. A lot of people who are moving out in the suburbs and other parts of the state, but there's also, because of continuing immigration, there's still a lot of need for Chinatown. A lot of immigrants, a sector of the immigrants are not, don't have high levels of education, and and they actually need a lot of the services and that's available in Chinatown to kind of support them. That's not available in the suburbs, and so that. So of course, being an enclave is you tend to kind of preserve some of your culture, and there are actually a few others, more native born in the U.S. who actually deliberately move back in the community because they remember their community fondly and they want to to preserve the culture. So I think both things are happening for the community. Did you want me to respond to some of these questions in the chat?
Yeah, looks like we have a couple questions there about GI Bill and then current trends in population.
Okay, so the one question, yes, the GI Bill, yes, that the Chinese did have access. On the one hand, they had access to the GI Bill for housing and education, and some of them took advantage of it. At the same time, in the same way that you could say, like, a lot of the veterans of color had access to GI Bill, but for various circumstances, they didn't have as much access as they would have if they were white. So there still was discrimination. For example, my father was a veteran, and so it just not directly to addressing the GI Bill, but when he came back after fighting a war in both Europe and Asia, he tried to go into a bar in New Hampshire, and he was refused service. And so that even though like this access was available, sometimes it's not distributed equally. But there were a number of Chinese that took advantage of housing and the housing educational benefits that was available in the bill. The other question was overview of Chinese population in cities and towns in Massachusetts. So as I kind of indicated, there's a kind of a bifurcation in the Chinese population. The professionals tend to live more in the suburbs, and actually the largest concentration county-wise in Massachusetts is in Middlesex County. But at the same time, there's still a large working class population, and they tend to be in more urban areas such as Quincy and Malden, which and in Chinatown, which can offer them with life on the one hand, so where they can afford the housing, well, except maybe Chinatown, and where there are some services available. So, and then I guess probably the most significant suburban town, I believe, where you have professional managerial Chinese is probably Lexington. It used to be actually that when the Chinese moved out of Chinatown, they would actually live in cities and towns that were close to public transit because they still needed that connection of Chinatown. But when these better educated sectors of the population immigrated or developed, they would move out more in the suburbs. And of course, the post-World War II, we also developed the interstate highway system, which made them more, and people started to drive cars more, and so they could live in these different areas.
To sort of build off that a little bit, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between these sort of new areas in Quincy and Malden in relationship to kind of the traditional Chinatown? Is it sort of living and working situation? Is there mutual support, or are they more independent?
I think it's some of both. I mean, I think one advantage of Chinatown is that because of its long history, it's developed a very dense organizational structure, so that, you know, when I did a survey for my my dissertation, it turned out that it was like 75 organizations in Chinatown, and there's only 25 square blocks in it. So you had, and so that both from traditional associations as well as service associations and advocacy. And so you don't have that same concentration in Malden and Quincy, but clearly, like, things are being somewhat decentralized. A lot of the Chinatown service organizations, for example, have open satellite offices or branches in Malden and Quincy, as well as other areas with the Chinese, like in the Brighton neighborhood of Boston. So I think the community as a whole still looks to Chinatown for a lot of leadership in a lot of ways, or the center of activities. And it also happens that it's actually quite centrally located. I mean, it's close to like 1, 2, 3, I think 3 subway lines. And so, but, you know, over time, things are being more centralized. I think decentralized. I mean, Quincy certainly offers more, has more restaurants now than probably Chinatown has, and more Chinese businesses.
Anyone else have a question they'd like to pose? So either unmute or write it in the chat.
Unmute myself. Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm just wondering how young Chinese today look on what's happened in Hong Kong.
Young Chinese? Did you say young Chinese?
Yes, like college age and young professionals, how they see the communists taking back Hong Kong.
I would say on the whole that they're very critical of the Chinese government. However, some of the older population tend to be more supportive of the Chinese government.
Do you think that generational difference is based on sort of that generational closeness to the home country or something else?
Well, I can only, speculate. I think that some of the old people remember more about or experience China's history, and they do remember, a time when China was very weak and a lot of European, primarily European powers, dominated the country. So they're very concerned about China being strong. And also there's, in the history of China, there's been a lot of turmoil. So they have, I think, quite a lot of concern about protests and so on. And they also, as I mentioned, they want China to be strong, and maybe they see some of this authoritarianism as a sign of strength and so on. And the younger people are probably more used to, the right to voice their opinion and so on. So I think that they tend to be more critical of China, but they probably have less experience with, that past history.
Okay, looks like we've got some more questions coming in the chat. So could you speak more about the organizing against large-scale development in Chinatown? Give me a little preview of your book.
Well, I think Boston Chinatown is, why I wrote the book is I thought it was somewhat unique in that it's kind of organized a kind of a continuous struggle against gentrification of Chinatown for about 50 years. And when you look at other parts of Boston, a lot of ethnic neighborhoods like the West End, even the North End, parts of the South End have actually been, for want of a better word, developed over, and a lot of those populations have been driven out of the neighborhood. So, so what I kind of describe is how over the decades the community learned to organize and develop strategies to try to fight development. And it became more and more sophisticated. And it's been, the Chinatown community has tried a lot of different things, everything from protest politics to lobbying to development of master plans. And they have many, as I said, many organizations, including like community development corporations, as well as recently they formed a community land trust and so on. And so they have, to a certain extent, and at different times they've even, I think, led the city in terms of among the city neighborhoods in terms of organizing these protests and the plans of the Redevelopment Authority in Boston, which obviously affected more than Chinatown. Parts of, Charlestown, South Boston, Roxbury, they were all affected. So I think today, you could arguably say, like, Chinatown is the most active in the city, and they are. But I have to say, like, development there's lots of money and lots of resources behind development, and so Chinatown's land area is actually shrinking, even though its population is somewhat stable, and they've been able to maintain enough low-income housing that that at least for the foreseeable future, Chinatown will exist. But but it's unclear what's going to happen in the future. Well, just as it's unclear what's going to happen in the future to cities, and because is everybody coming back to work? But anyway, if you stand in the middle of Chinatown, you look all around. If you look to the north, there's these huge towers, luxury housing. If you look to the south, it's the same thing. If you look to the east, it's highways, and you look to the west, it's New England Medical Center. So it's really being squeezed. So I would say that even though we've achieved some success in terms of trying to preserve the community, things are very uncertain. And actually, maybe that first questioner was referring to this new proposal to build a large development on. It's actually the entrance of I-93 into the city of Boston, which is right next to Chinatown, and the state recently proposed developing a large structure there. However, they haven't really involved the Chinatown community, and so there's a big question, how it would affect it. There's a huge demand, still a huge demand for housing, and every time a housing development with affordable housing is available, thousands of people will sign up for it. And yeah, but at the same time, its central location is attractive to developers. I mean, at one time before they passed the regulations against Airbnb in the city, there were 100 available Airbnb sites in Chinatown itself. Oh, some other questions is, when did your family come to you? All right. The question is, when did your family come to the US? What discriminatory or favorable experiences have you and they had? And do you see a need for local or state policy changes? Well, I'm kind of a, I don't know, demographic anomaly, but I'm not unusual for the Chinese community. I think my family has been here for 5 or 6 generations, but I'm the first one that was born in the US. The first generation was born in the US. So this is because as I mentioned in my presentation, that they had laws against the formation of families, so that people would go back to China, their wives were there, and they would have their families there. But my parents were able to immigrate. My father came in the 1930s, and he was only here a couple of years before he was drafted into the U.S. Army. And then my mother was a war bride, and she came. So even though there was a small quota, U.S. soldiers were allowed to bring in women that they married overseas, and so that's how the first significant number of Chinese families came. So that was in the mid 1940s that my mother came. So I think so. Discriminatory or favorable experiences. Well, I think that they suffered some discrimination, but you just kind of soldiered on. They kind of led typical lives in the sense that my father was a restaurant worker his whole life, and my mother was a garment worker, which at that time Boston still had a garment industry, but it was dying, and so it primarily hired immigrant workers, and almost all Chinese working women in Chinatown work in the garment factories. And so, I think, they were, proud of their work. And so that I think that was a favorable experience for them. At the same time, they had other high aspirations, but I guess like that, because they themselves couldn't fulfill it, they concentrated on their children. And just want to address this last part of the question about the need for changes. I think, as you know, there's a lot of controversy about critical race theory. But I think that people in the US know very little about Chinese and other Asians, and as well as the history of other peoples of color. And I think that it's very important that they understand this. And that is a change that I would like to see. Actually, a few years ago, the US government finally apologized for the Chinese Exclusion Act. But that's all it was an apology. So they didn't set aside any funds to support education about that history of Chinese and what happened. And I would like to see some of that support, because I think that we should know about each other's history. Yeah, so that's a major change, I would say. I would like to see.
So we're just about out of time. We had one final question about older generations supporting the Chinese government, which you touched on a little bit already. We talked about the generational difference. I don't know if there's anything you want to add as a final comment.
No, I mean, I'm not that critical of the older generation, because I kind of, from my research, I kind of realized that the lives that they faced, and it was pretty tough. So I can understand why they would have these feelings. So even though I'm more sympathetic to the young people's attitudes toward China.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending tonight, and I hope you learned a lot. And of course, thank you again to Michael for informing us about all these historical facts and tropes that we may or may not have been aware of.
Yes, thank you everybody for being here.
Have a good night, everyone.